Hello everyone, this is Ray Space here to present a test of the standard crewed moon mission that would occur at the beginning of my future history timeline. So the future history timeline is the background, the lore for other stories and other things that I'm going to do. And so the way that the characters get to the moon is initially going to be like this, is basically what I'm saying, and I'm testing out the method that I have devised using my Kasei rocket here. It has an awkward balance because the lander is my Kumo lander, and it's sort of got an offset center of mass, and also I'm offsetting the third stage here because of the Kumo's landing legs extending above it and me not wanting to have a very large fairing, so I'm trying to make the fairing as tight as possible. So I've offset the third stage inside the fairing there. This is the Kasei rocket. In recent videos I've been testing its reusability, at least the first stage reusability. You might have seen it land on a drone ship. Its capacity is 90 tons to orbit while reserving enough fuel to land on a drone ship with the first stage. In this video we're not going to follow the first stage down, but I'm going to reserve the fuel in the first stage so that it can do what it does. And we're not carrying just 90 tons, we're actually heavier than that because the second stage is not going to reach orbit. It's going to end up being disposed of, and the third stage will finish orbit, so we don't have to worry about some debris in orbit around Earth. So here I'm just checking staging there. And actually I messed up. The fairings probably shouldn't go immediately right now, although it's a good time for it because the thrust to weight ratio was very low. But here we have the second stage. The configuration of the Kasei rocket is with 5 engines on the first stage and 1 of those engines on the second stage, but the second stage engine has a big vacuum nozzle. And then in this case we have 4 very small engines on the third stage. I think they'll eventually be somewhat larger, but not in thrust. They'll just have larger nozzles, and there'll be variants of the LE5 engine from Japan because that makes sense based on the timeline. The timeline sort of has a group of nations, but the one that has the hydrolox is Japan. Well, actually India also has hydrogen and oxygen engines too, and India will be working closely with Japan. In fact, India is slated to develop the capsule that we will see later, the Lynx spacecraft, or in Hindi it would be Ban Bilav, is what I believe Lynx ends up being. So here though we have Kumo. Kumo is spider in Japanese, so this would be developed by the Japanese, and the upper stage we have here is based on the H3, and it's the same diameter as the H3 rocket from Japan, so I made sure it's 5.27 meters, which is the same, and we'll have just probably a pair of engines, LE5s, on it. So anyway, here's the Kumo. The Kumo was of course offset a little bit on the third stage, that's why it was knocked a little bit weirdly. And the question is, we're in a high orbit around the moon. That's good for keeping it around the moon because we don't want it to be perturbed by the moon's sort of lumpy gravity. But in its high orbit around the moon, it's eventually going to have to get into a low orbit, so we're hoping that the Lynx spacecraft can bring it into a low orbit. Unfortunately, the docking port that the Lynx spacecraft is going to use to bring it into a low orbit is at the top. It's not at the center of mass. So we'll have to see whether the Lynx spacecraft can do that or whether the whole thing will just flip out. So that's a question mark at this point. We have our crew here. The lander is delivered to the moon without crew. It stays there, and then we send crew afterwards. This is probably going to be the way NASA is going to be going forward as well. They'll either have the Starship hanging out at the moon, or they'll have the Blue Origin lunar lander hanging out at the moon for a while, and then we'll have the crew arrive as the launch escape system went away and this stage runs out. Again, suborbital. The third stage will complete orbit. This time I had a different engine on it, but probably we should have just gone with the smaller ones. This one is completely different from what I wanted actually, but the stage is still the same physical size. It's just that I have a different engine this time, and we don't really need its big nozzle efficiency in this case. The Lynx spacecraft has more than enough to get over there. And here we're completing the burn with the third stage, and we'll also do the mid-course correction with the third stage, even though we don't really need to do that. The problem is rendezvousing with the lunar lander because the lander is in a polar orbit, and of course we launched it at a different time. So now we're approaching with a like 75-degree inclination difference. So rendezvousing gets to be real tough, but still manageable because we have so much delta V in the service module for the links, because this is not its normal methane oxygen service module that it used to have. This is now going to be a hydrolox service module, again with an intended variant on the LE5 engine from Japan, because again we're using those. I guess we could conceive of a variant on the Indian CE20 engine, but the main thing that we need out of it is more ignitions than either of those engines currently have. So either one will be fine as long as we have a bunch of ignitions, which is more than they currently have. So that's why it has to be a development on either the LE5 or the CE20. It's looking really small right here, but I'll fix that. I've got a long list of things to fix actually. After this test, about 15 different items that I have to fix. First of all, I have to actually come up with the service module model, because this is just a procedural tank, and also a model for the third stage. I wanted to replace the Methalox RCS in the links with Hydrolox, just to make everything Hydrolox, so it'd be a little bit easier. Anyway, but we've rendezvoused, and now I have to see whether the service module engine can actually bring the orbit down while attached to the lander. You can see the RCS working heavily. We have it throttled minimally, but it seems to work out. We're only using about half of our pitch. So even though it's badly out of line with the center of mass, the mass of the service module is probably helping right now to stabilize it because it's relatively heavy, and the drop tanks on the Kumo lander are relatively light. If you haven't seen the Kumo lander before, it's obviously looking a little bit strange to you, and that's because it's got descent tanks at the bottom that drop off as we transfer the crew in. And the goal here is that while we don't have in situ resource utilization on the moon, the lander will carry these drop tanks. But then once we have resource utilization on the moon, in other words, by the time we get water drilling and converting to hydrogen and oxygen on the moon at the South Pole, as I'm targeting right here, then the Kumo won't need those drop tanks. Instead, it'll just carry its regular tanks, its main tanks that has alongside the lander itself, and refuel on the surface. So it'll just use those for descent and then again for ascent. A KOS script manages our descent here, so it did the initial descent burn. Unfortunately, I still have stock plumes on the Kumo. I'll have to fix that. That's on my to-fix list as well, as is the fact that the Kumo uses MMH and Mon 3 RCS, which is a whole other thing. But the rationale for the Kumo being made this way was so that it could be co-manifested on SLS with a Orion, so that, especially an SLS Block 2 or potentially a Block 1B, so that we could send the lander first and then the drop tanks separately, and then they would be docked together at Lunar Gateway and then proceed. So off go the drop tanks. When we hit 100 meters per second is when they are told to go off. All this is controlled by script by KOS. Another logic to the Kumo lander is that it is short, so that it doesn't cause me any tipping on the moon problems, as I do tend to tip landers over quite a lot. Though, interestingly, the Blue Origin Blue Moon Mark II doesn't seem to tip over for me. It seems to be very resilient in that respect, even though it's rather tall. Here, this will try to tip over, and that's because we're not landing where I originally wanted to. It looks like the script is a bit off, well, quite a bit off, 75 kilometers, and I think that's because it was written for the equator, and going with the rotation of the moon. We're polar right now, and so I don't think it's made to compensate for that. So we ended up on a hill because it wasn't where I was supposed to land. I didn't plant any flag, I just had Val go outside and get back in. I wanted to do this quickly because this is all just a test. I have a lot of things to fix, as I've mentioned, so I was just identifying all those things that I would need to fix, and then I will fix them and sort of create a definitive cinematic of the whole deal. If you have any comments as to the nature of this plan, feel free to tell me. This is the time to fix things if you have any suggestions. But it is an interesting plan. It is meant to be an interesting plan, but feasible in theory. So, is it a little bit complicated? Yeah, but it's actually more lightweight than the Blue Moon Mark II, this lander is. So, it has that benefit, and that's because of the drop tank situation and the fact that we're not trying to get to Lunar Gateway at all with this right now. So we don't have to pack all the extra fuel, and in fact it's configured to manage with less delta V than it currently has. Blue Moon Mark II isn't meant for ISRU right now because, you know, it's packing 6,000 meters per second and all that, so that I can get all the way from Lunar Gateway down and then back. But we're more modest in our means here. We just need to quickly get crew down and back. Though the TPAA plan, the future history that I've created, does have Lunar Gateway in it, and the Japanese do contribute a module to Lunar Gateway. That's all planned, and there is interaction with Lunar Gateway in the middle of it, but that interaction will be managed by this spacecraft, the Lynx, not by the lander. Though the lander can always be tugged up to the station. It would just be tugged. Normally, it could be tugged by this, it seems. But normally I would probably use some sort of ion tug without it being crewed, so the lunar lander would not be crewed to be tugged to the station for whatever reason, and then brought back down to a lower orbit before operations to the surface. So, here is our return. I expect that the service module here will have extendable solar panels, not just surface ones like I have right now here. Once I make it properly, and it'll probably also jettison with more force. That's a little bit weak and was a little bit worrisome because now it's hanging out too close to the spacecraft. Alright, so we are headed down. Fortunately, this time I did check the heat shield to make sure that it was resilient. However, there is this weird rolling issue with the Lynx spacecraft that I'm not too sure about. We are using descent mode, which means that the spacecraft tilts when it hits the atmosphere, but it sort of rolls a lot, and then the roll rate does increase, and I'm not entirely sure why. Some aerodynamic difference from one side to another. It's pretty darn symmetrical, but it does this thing. And it causes them to have a high G experience when they're not supposed to be having a high G experience. Also, we had a weird situation where Type Life Support wasn't consuming the right amount of food, water, and oxygen. I'll have to review those numbers. That didn't help us at all because we definitely stayed within the amount of time they were supposed to have, and it was just more mass that we were carrying around. So, anyway, they did make it back safely. It was a successful lunar mission, and this is the format that I'm using initially. So with that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.